please come to order. I'd like to welcome everybody to the 25th day of the session, Tuesday, February 14th, Valentine's Day 2023. Today in history. So today in history, February 14th, 1870, the Sweetwater County Board of Commissioners, in a vote of 2-1, approves Esther Hobart Morris's application for Justice of the Peace. This made her the first female Justice of the Peace in the United States. She served for just about 9 months. She served the full length of her term, but could not secure a renomination from either party in Sweetwater County. She lived until 1902 and is buried in Cheyenne, right here in Cheyenne. Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Allemand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Clouston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haraldson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Hornock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez-Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Zwanitzer Dan? Zwanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers? Nicholas? Brown? Larson Lloyd? Newsom? 62 present.
I would like to welcome Ronnie Lopez, a stake president here in Cheyenne from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for our prayer of the day. Please rise.
Our dear Father in heaven, we humbly bow our heads before Thee and give Thee thanks, Father, for the blessings that we have in our lives. Father, we're grateful for this land of freedom that we live in, for this great state of Wyoming that gives us so many privileges and benefits, for the beauty and grandeur that we're surrounded by. We're grateful, Father, for this wonderful body of elected officials, for these public servants, for dedicating their time and their talents toward building and improving this great state of Wyoming. Father, we're grateful for Thy hand in our lives, for the strength, for the spirit that we receive from Thee. We ask Thee, Father, in the busyness of life, that we will take a moment to recognize the blessings that come from Thee. Recognize Thy hand. Father, as this legislative body is at work We ask thee to please bless them, to be inspired, to have the citizenry of this great state at the forefront of their mind and in their hearts as they act and as they seek to do the will of the people that have elected them to these positions. Father, we ask thee to please bless their families. Bless them with thy choicest blessings for the sacrifices in which they make as these wonderful individuals are away from home, working on behalf of the citizenry here of this great state. Father, we ask for thy choicest blessings to be bestowed upon the citizenry, that our fellow brothers and sisters living in this state will be buoyed and strengthened, that they will feel of thy love and have greater peace and recognize the blessings that they have in their lives, especially as they live in a place that grants them so many liberties and freedoms. Father, we love thee very much and are grateful for all that thou does, and say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Stake President Lopez, for your words. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Sir, thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Thank you. The House will please come to order. Do we have any privileges before I start out? Representative Harrelson,
Privilege of the floor.
please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is Rachel Rodriguez Williams' birthday today, and I just solidified she is 25. So
Yeah!
yeah.
Birthday to you. Happy birthday, Rachel. With that, Journal Committee report.
Your Journal Committee reports that the Journal of February 13th, 2023 has been read and recommends that it be approved. Representatives Chestick and Ward.
We have a special event this morning, but it's not here yet. So we'll continue on to messages from the Senate.
Message 297. Mr. Speaker, the Senate appointed Senate conferees to meet with the Like Committee Number 1 from the House on amendments to House Bill 41. The Senate conferees are Senator Hicks, Chairman, Senator Brennan, Senator Jones. Sincerely, Mike Cunningham, Senate Deputy Chief Clerk. Message 311. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 181, Online Sports Wagering Amendments. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form by the vote indicated. Ayes 25, noes 6. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 312. Mr. Speaker, the Senate adopted the Committee of the Whole report, failing the bill listed below by the vote indicated. House Bill 145, Disclosures of Sensitive Information, Law Enforcement. Ayes 8, noes 20, excused 3. The bill has been indefinitely postponed. Sincerely, Mike Cunningham, Senate Deputy Chief Clerk.
All right, I still don't see our special event coming. I think actually our special event is about halfway down the aisle. So I think we'll just kind of stand at ease for a moment. Representatives, joining us this morning is the University of Wyoming's head football coach, Craig Bohl. He has led the Cowboys to 5 bowl games and 1 conference championship game in the last 9 years. Coach Bohl is proud of how his program has embraced the theme of cowboy ethics and the accomplishments of the young men in the classroom. In 2020, the UW football team earned a 3.0 GPA for the group, over 100 players. The last 4 years have been the highest team GPA in school history. Coach Bohl has turned the Wyoming football program from a program near the bottom of the Mountain West Conference to a perennial contender. Please help me in welcoming Coach Craig Bohl.
Mr. Speaker, privileged to address this.
Please, please.
Thank you. Well, it was about 9 or 10 years ago, I had an opportunity the first time to go in front of this imposing group. It's great to be back. And what I'd like to do is just touch on a couple points where Cowboy football is at, where we're going. And also want to say thank you to this group. The citizens of Wyoming are privileged to have this body serve. We recognize that the decisions you make are not easy. And the skill and the competency and the wisdom that you have is really profound. I'm sure there's probably some robust discussions that occur in this room, kind of like us and a coaching staff, but if we agreed on everything, we wouldn't have much to talk about. But today we're going to talk about Cowboy football. Some things are noted nationally. First of all, much has changed. Tom Berman approached me 10 years ago about becoming the head football coach for the Wyoming Cowboys. At that time, he said, "Coach, we have lost our way. We need to rebrand Cowboy football, and it needs to be Cowboy tough football." And I agreed with him because I thought that football team had kind of gotten soft, lost their identity on who they were and what they were about. So he and I locked arms and came up with a vision to move Cowboy football forward. Are where we want to be right now? Are we satisfied? No. There's still more work to be done, but we're in a significantly different place. At the other end of the hall, and I think it'll grace this body sometime soon, is a bronze boot. Make no mistake, that's a symbol of pride within our citizens and our players and our university and all across the country. And it's hard to keep. The next thing is if you look, we are consistently now going to bowl games. Cowboy football had this up and down strokes, and now we're consistently winning and going to bowl games. That's not easy, but we need to take the next step. The other thing is if you are an NFL football fan, the University of Wyoming has produced more NFL players than any other school in the Mountain West. And they're just not participants. We're talking about big-time players on the biggest stage in the world. We had one of them play this last week in the Super Bowl, Marcus Epps. The year prior, we had another guy that hails from Natrona County, wears number 55, wears Steamboat thigh pads. A lot of times, the state of Wyoming flag under his helmet, Logan Wilson. So the national media has noted that. What the national media and the local media and our state media has not noted is some of the accomplishments like our GPA. So what changed? Well, first of all, there's a member of this body known as Representative Harshman. I know him as Coach Harshman, a dear friend. So I got this job, and Coach will probably remember, I called him up, and we met up in a Starbucks in Casper. And I said, "Coach, we got to roll up our sleeves and get this thing right. This is important to our state." So he and I began to discuss where Cowboy football was at and what changes we needed to make. Well, at the end of the discussion, he said, "One other thing I just want to mention. There's two players on our team that I think you need to look at, Coach. Our quarterback stood 6'1", 180 pounds. Pretty good arm. I'm convinced he got his athleticism from his mother. The other one was, and that's Josh Harshman. The other one was Logan Wilson. Logan stood about 6'2", 185 pounds. I believe he was your kicker, defensive back. So we offered those two guys a scholarship. Now, what did those two guys do? Well, Josh turned out to be a great tight end for us. Multi-year starter, a captain his senior year. Logan Wilson came in. Logan Wilson right now is 6'2", 245 pounds. He's a 3-down Mike and wears a green dot in the NFL. His head football coach called me up and said he is destined for the Pro Bowl. So that didn't happen by chance. Now, those guys were developed. There's another young man on our team, Will Pellissier. Will Pellissier hails, we call him AKA Bighorn. Will Pellissier is from Bighorn. He came in as a running back. Now he's a wide receiver. He's the fastest guy on our team. Many more players from the state have been on our team through the years. So when I first got hired, and Coach would mention, we had more players from Germany than we did the state of Wyoming. And if I had a quarter for every time people told me that you can't win with Wyoming players, I'd be a rich man. So those naysayers who say you can't win with Wyoming players, I'm telling you, we can't win without them. Okay? We can't get it done without them. So here's where they're from. Many of them are from your communities. I'm just going to go down the list. First of all, Casper, Natrona County, right there. Gillette, Sheridan, Buffalo, Bighorn, Cody, Lovell, Jackson, Star Valley, Lander, Laramie, Rock Springs, Green River, Mountain View, Torrington, Yoder, and Cheyenne. So we wanted to create a pathway for these guys who would give their left leg to play for the Cowboys. But these guys who have grit and determination, they're going to need some meat on their bones. Football is a man's game played by men, and it'll bear your soul naked. And you better be able to put some meat on their bones or they're going to get thrown out of the saloon. So what happened several years ago with this body created the Cowboy Match. Funding that went into Cowboy athletics. Not just football, but for all the sports. And those dollars made a profound impact. So you look at your return on your investment. We're noted by the improvement of what's going on the football field, without question. We got more work to do. But think about all the things that have occurred that are not noted. And you look at your return on your investment. And so here's what I would say. Many of our players, both in state and out of state, have chosen or will choose to reside in this state. Without question, our most valuable resource we can all agree on is our young people. We can all agree on that. And many of these men have chosen or will choose, they will become husbands, they will become fathers, and they will make their home in this state. And they will be part of this state that competes on a national and global economy. People tell me, okay, they're average students. Baloney. These guys aren't average. They are the best of the best, and they will win. And if you want to bet against them, good luck, Jack Buck. So here's a couple of the areas that they have chosen to major in or roll up their sleeves to contribute to the state of Wyoming. Here's some of the fields: energy, engineering, education, medicine, animal science, criminal justice, information technology. That's just to name a few. Pretty impressive workforce. Those things are not noted, but I can tell you what, those men love this state. They love Wyoming, and they will ride for the brand, and they will win. And so we're so proud of that. So let's get back to football. All right? We are now knocking on the door. We keep on knocking on the door. Our goal is to return Cowboy football back to national prominence. I see some gray-haired guys in the back of the room, and you knew when the Cowboys ruled the country. That's where we're headed. We're not there yet. We got more work to do, but the good news is we got some bullets in our six-shooter, okay? I've never been more optimistic about Cowboy football. And in 200 days, we open up against the Texas Tech Red Raiders right here in War Memorial Stadium. Hope to see you. Go Pokes! All right.
I would like to thank Coach Bohl for his commitment to the students and to Wyoming, and we wish him all the best, and we wish the Pokes the best. Oh, Representative Sherwood, a privilege?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So today is day 2 of Random Act of Kindness Week. Just a reminder that I have the House bingo card up here on my desk. So far, we're kind of neck and neck with the senators, but neither side has gotten a bingo yet. So as a reminder, if you offer to help a new legislator, or you recognize something positive happening in the chamber, or come to the mic and offer some positive thought with the body, you can come and check it off on the bingo card. So a reminder, if the House beats the Senate, we get pastries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go Pokes. I'm going to go on bingo card.
All right, there's one. We're at that order of business of Senate files on first reading. The first Senate file for our consideration is Senate File 99.
Senate File 99, sponsored by Senator Barlow.
First reading of the bill.
Witnessing of wells, remote methods.
Senate File 99 is referred to Committee Number 1 Judiciary. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 152.
Senate File 152, sponsored by Senator Pappas.
First reading of the bill.
Occupational therapist, criminal history.
Senate File 152 is referred to Committee Number 1 Judiciary. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 181.
Senate File 181, sponsored by Senator Schuler.
First reading of the bill.
Drug-induced homicide.
Senate File 181 is referred to Committee Number 1 Judiciary. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 142.
Senate File 142, sponsored by Senator Scott.
First reading of the bill.
Carbon capture and sequestration.
Senate File 142 is referred to Committee Number 2 Appropriations. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 148.
Senate File 148, sponsored by Senator Kinski.
First reading of the bill.
Preemption of local firearms regulation.
Senate File 148 is referred to Committee Number 2 Appropriations. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 157.
Senate File 157, sponsored by Senator Cooper.
First reading of the bill.
Weed and pest mitigation, tribal inclusion 2.
Senate File 157 is referred to Committee Number 2 Appropriations. The next bill for our consideration is Senate Joint Resolution 11.
Senate Joint Resolution 11, sponsored by Senator Larson.
First reading of the bill.
Convention of States.
Senate Joint Resolution Number 11 is referred to Committee Number 3 Revenue. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 151.
Senate File 151, sponsored by Senator Hutchins.
First reading of the bill.
Wyoming Prescription Drug Transparency Act.
Senate File 151 is referred to Committee Number 3 Revenue. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 130.
Senate File 130, sponsored by Senator Hutchins.
First reading of the bill.
Educational Freedom Act.
Senate File 130 is referred to Committee Number 4 Education. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 133.
Senate File 133, sponsored by Senator Schuler.
First reading of the bill.
Student eligibility in interscholastic sports.
Senate File 133 is referred to Committee Number 4 Education. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 168.
Senate File 168, sponsored by Senator Larson.
First reading of the bill.
Alternative teaching certificate.
Senate File 168 is referred to Committee Number 4 Education. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 92.
Senate File 92, sponsored by Senator Case.
First reading of the bill.
Small customer electrical generation.
Senate File 92 is referred to Committee Number 6 Travel. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 134.
Senate File 134, sponsored by Senator Bouchard.
First reading of the bill.
Right to farm, real estate disclosures.
Senate File 134 is referred to Committee Number 7 Corporations. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 164.
Senate File 164, sponsored by Senator Boner.
First reading of the bill.
Public improvement contract requirements, amendments.
Senate File 164 is referred to Committee Number 7 Corporations. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 67.
Senate File 67, sponsored by Senator Schuler.
First reading of the bill.
Multi-purpose vehicles, disabled license plates.
Senate File 67 is referred to Committee Number 8, Transportation. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 65.
Senate File 65, sponsored by Senator Baldwin.
First reading of the bill.
Compensation of local registrars, repeal.
Senate File 65 is referred to Committee Number 10, Labor. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 131.
Senate File 131, sponsored by Senator Hutchings.
First reading of the bill.
Prohibition on delivery of unsolicited ballot forms.
Senate File 131 is referred to Committee Number 10, Labor. Reports from standing committees.
Senate File 84, sponsored by Senator Ellis. Education, Model Student Attendance Policies, an act relating to education. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 4, Education, to whom is referred Senate File 84 engrossed, Education, Model Student Attendance Policies, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Allred, Andrew, Berger, Brown, Clauston, Lawley, Northrup, Obermueller, Provenza. Representative Northrup, Chairman.
Is that it? All right. We're at that order of business of bills on second reading. The first bill for our consideration is Senate File 8.
Senate File 8, sponsored by Senator Baldwin. Essential subsidy payments to behavioral health centers, an act relating to public health and safety.
Senate File 8 having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 9.
Senate File 9, sponsored by Senator Baldwin. Medicaid coverage, licensed pharmacists, an act relating to Medicaid Medical Assistance and Service Act.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 9. Would ask for your favorable consideration. So members, you'll remember the 30 minutes we had on this yesterday. This is really what I would call a cleanup amendment. It takes the wording regarding abortions as part of the sentence on pharmacists under Medicaid reimbursement and actually puts it back in Title 42 when we talk about medical assistance, which applies kind of across the board to all 37 of these professions to have that same, I guess, it's the same concept in a better statutory place, which makes it clear under the bill. I think the wish of my standing committee on ensuring that there is no chemical abortions that pharmacists could prescribe while keeping the actual numbering of all the Romanettes separate and kind of cleaner. So what this amendment isn't a policy change, it just really tries to clean up to fit the policy will of my committee with what should actually be in statute. I would be happy to answer any questions on it.
Representative Yin for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, I will move to divide the amendment, and I would move to divide for Division 1, lines 1 and 2, and then Division 2 is everything else.
So please repeat that.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to divide lines 1 and 2 as Division 1, and then everything else is Division 2.
That's divisible. Which one do you want to start with?
Mr. Speaker, let's move with Division 1.
Representative Yin on Division 1.
I think it's a good division. Vote aye.
Representative Jennings for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could we have a little more clarification on what this would do?
Anybody else for their first time? Chairman Zwanitzer.
So what I believe this is attempting to do is, it now is two separate policy questions before the body. By this division, you just be eliminating the language completely where it is in the bill. And the second division would reinsert that language somewhere else. So certainly happy to support this division because I don't believe where the language is the correct place in statute for this concept, should you want it. But then I think the greater battle will be on division number 2, on whether you want this in that chapter or not. So certainly support this division.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Ward for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a question then. If Division 1 is adopted and that amendment is deleted and Division 2 fails, then the will of the committee is thwarted. Am I correct?
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the bringer? Representative Jennings for your second time.
And I think since I didn't really hear any response to my first question, I think I would offer that maybe we should vote no. It looks to me like this might change what our policy decision was the other day.
Chairman Zwanitzer for this, your second time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to answer the good representative from Casper's question, I would agree it would thwart the will of the 5-4 vote in the committee. But of course, this is the whole body, so that will be done.
Representative Ward, you want a second bite at the apple? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am on and against Division 1.
Representative Yin for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it is, again, the policy decision of the body to decide what it wants to do. I'm just giving the body two choices. And so if it still wants to move it, then it can adopt Division number 2. But right now we are discussing Division 1, and I would ask you to adopt Division 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor of Division 1 to second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 9 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Division number 1 has passed. Division being called. All those in favor of Division 1, please rise. All those opposed, please rise. That's an Thank you. Division number 1 has failed. Representative Yin on Division 2.
Well, Mr. Chairman, given that the standing committee amendment language is still in there, I don't think it makes much sense to adopt Division number 2 either. So vote no on Division 2.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Mr. Speaker, I guess I would ask the body to keep Division 2 and vote aye. And then it's my supposition and my hope that maybe tomorrow on third reading, we could delete the language and the body may be more agreeable to that on what came as a simple pharmacy bill. But I would encourage you to vote aye on this amendment. You'll see a third reading amendment. I believe that the body is comfortable where the language needs to be, that perhaps you would all be comfortable cleaning up the other part of the statute at that point would be my anticipation and my hope to vote aye.
Representative Stiff for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, I have just an informational question. The amendment division as drafted says that medical assistance does not include payment for services of a licensed pharmacist that results in an abortion. So how does this apply to drugs that may have dual uses? That is, a drug that may be used for an abortion, but a drug that may be used for a non-abortion purpose. The pharmacist, in making the sale or in submitting the request for reimbursement from Medicaid, how does what's the practice in the industry? Is it typical for the pharmacist to know what the result is?
Representative Ward for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am on and for this amendment.
Representative Craig for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just, I guess, a question for the bringer of the amendment or possibly someone else, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit tomorrow. But my question is does the language within this amendment abrogate statutory language where we already have regarding this subject? And if you look in your statute books, 35.6.117 already prohibits this. And so I guess my question is are we overriding that language? And if so, do we need to reference it, or how are we going to clean that up? And I just think before tomorrow, before we get to final reading, we probably ought to look at that. Fine with the policy statement. I just don't want to create conflict within the Green Book unnecessarily.
Representative Provenza for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And question for the bringer of the amendment. Do we have a definition in our statutes about what chemical abortion is or medications? Thank you.
Anybody else for their first time? For their second time, Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so the answer to that last question is no, I don't believe we do, because there's a piece of legislation which I suppose is probably not needed if we're going to keep this going on this bill. But again, ladies and gentlemen, this bill, when you talk about what pharmacists can and can't do in regards to this language, they were doing these consults where they have multiple medications for a patient, and the pharmacist goes through and spends some time looking at all the meds and all the dosages and saying, you might want to check with your different specialists and different providers, because here are some concerns when these medications interact. And they just wanted to be reimbursed for this kind of consult that they do now as standard practice. So when the former speaker from Sweetwater County asked if there were, if pharmacists are doing this, I don't believe the answer is yes, unless they had some belief that the interaction of certain medications could result in an abortion. But I think that's very, very unlikely. And then the answer to the question from the good country lawyer, there is place in statute already that covers, that you can have Medicaid funds used in abortion. So I was trying not to interfere with that statute, and had LSO was fully aware of that when I had them draft this statute. This was just to fit into this chapter on medical assistance. When you look at the list of providers under these 37 different providers we're reimbursing. So I don't think it conflicts with that at all. It was meant to dovetail into that and not be a problem. We're getting to the point where this whole kind of bill was simple and is an issue now. So I'm still going to ask you to vote yes on this amendment. I don't think it hurts it if you vote yes or no. It only hurts it if I probably can't get the interesting language out of where it currently is in this bill on third reading. And then I may ask you to vote no on the whole bill tomorrow, because this is a 15-minute consult and it wasn't a whole lot of money for these pharmacists. It was just kind of a nice thing to do to reimburse them for what they were already doing. And now the bill's going in all sorts of weird areas that I don't think were anticipated. But for now, please vote aye on this division.
Anybody else for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Yin for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All I really want to say is I feel really bad for the sponsor of this bill.
All those in favor of Division 2 to second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 9 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Division 2 has been adopted. Senate File 9 having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 11.
Senate File 11, sponsored by Labor, Cancer Early Detection Amendments, an act relating to public health and safety.
Senate File 11 having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 25.
Senate File 25, sponsored by Judiciary, District and Prosecuting Attorneys Bar License Requirement, an act relating to district and county and prosecuting attorneys.
Senate File 25 having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 31.
Senate File 31, sponsored by Judiciary, Adjacent Land Resource Data Trespass, Repeal, an act relating to crimes and offenses.
Senate File 31 having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 51.
Senate File 51, sponsored by Education, School Finance, Regional Cost Adjustment, an act relating to school finance.
Senate File 51 having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. We're at that order of business of bills on third reading and final passage. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the consent list consisting of the following Senate files: Senate File 18, Senate File 20, Senate File 41, Senate File 59, Senate File 63, and Senate Joint Resolution 7.
Will the reading clerk read the bills on the consent list?
Senate File 18, sponsored by Transportation, Benefits for Spouses of Law Enforcement Members, an act relating to the administration of government being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 20, sponsored by Transportation, Driver's License and ID Card Photo Quality, an act relating to driver's license and identification cards being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 41, sponsored by Revenue, Skill-Based Amusement Games, Authorized Locations, an act relating to gaming being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 59, sponsored by Travel, State Parks Account, Agency Expenditure Authority, an act relating to state lands being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 63, sponsored by Revenue, Tax Administration Revisions, an act relating to taxation and revenue being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate Joint Resolution 7, sponsored by Senator Driscoll, Support for Taiwan, a joint resolution in support of Taiwan being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Having been read three separate times, the question is, shall these bills pass the House? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Allemand, Allred, Andrew, Angelos, Banks, Bear, Berger, Brown, Burkhart, Byron, Chadwick, Chestick, Clauston, Conrad, Crago, Davis, Eklund, Haroldson, Harshman, Heiner, Henderson, Warnock, Jennings, Knapp, Larson Lloyd, Larson JT, Lawley, Locke, Nyman, Newsom, Nicholas, Nemec, Northrup, Oakley, Obermuller, O'Hearn, Olson, Ottman, Pendergraft, Penn, Provenza, Rodriguez-Williams, Sherwood, Singh, Slagle, Smith, Stith, Storer, Strock, Stivar, Tarver, Trujillo, Walters, Ward, Washut, Western, Winter, Wiley, Yin, Zwanitzer Dan, Zwanitzer Dave, Speaker Summers. Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 61 aye, 1 excused. As for Senate File 18, are there any changes? Jennings, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 60 aye, 1 no, 1 excused. As for Senate File 20, are there any changes? Warnock, aye to no. Smith, aye to no. Slagle, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Strock, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Ward, aye to no. Angelos, aye to no. Rodriguez Williams, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Ottman, aye to no. Ellermand, aye to no. Urquhart, aye to no. Oakley, aye to no. Nicholas, aye to no. Larson JT, aye to no. And Conrad, aye to no. Further changes? Western, aye to no. Singh, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 40 aye, 21 no, 1 excused. As for Senate File 41, are there any changes? Warnock, aye to no. Andrew, aye to no. Zwanitzer Dan, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Further changes? Singh, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 56 aye, 5 no, 1 excused. As for Senate File 59, are there any changes? Stivar, aye to no. Slagle, aye to no. Smith, aye to no. Singh, aye to no. Henn, aye to no. Strock, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Ward, aye to no. Haroldson, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Heiner, aye to no. Allemand, aye to no. Tarver, aye to no. Banks, aye to no. Pendergraft, aye to no. Locke, aye to no. Zwanitzer Dan, aye to no. Nyman, aye to no.
No, Chief, I'm not sure on Rodriguez Williams. I don't know what her vote was. She was standing and you called.
Oh.
Anyway,
Sorry, behind the flowers. Rodriguez Williams, aye to no. Thank you. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 41 aye, 20 no, 1 excused. As for Senate File 63, are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 61 aye, 1 excused. As for Senate Joint 7, are there any changes? Warnock, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Allemand, aye to no. Larson Lloyd? Further changes? Closing vote? Vote closed. 58 aye, 3 no, 1 excused.
Having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate Files 18, 20, 41, 59, 63, and Senate Joint Resolution 7 have passed the House. We are now at that order of business of bills on third reading regular. The first bill for
Mr.
our
Speaker.
consideration is Senate File 68. Representative Craig Bohl, did you come to me on that?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Rule 7-3, I would ask to lay back Senate File 68 for an additional day.
Absent any objection, Senate File 68 is laid back 1 day. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 176. I always just roll them to the bottom if they're pulled, so 176 is the one I called.
Senate File 176, sponsored by Senator Driscoll. Solid Waste Disposal Districts Consolidation, an act relating to counties, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring you third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 176 and would ask for your favorable consideration. Folks, what this is this was brought to me by a group who works with our county commissioners, and they would like to have this language in there, also brought by one of my own county commissioners in my district. They said they'd like to have this just to clean up and to provide it, and you can read in the language, each solid waste disposal board involved in the proposed consideration first approve the consolidation. And so what they're wanting to do before they just present it to commissioners, make sure that the districts are on board and they approve it. And they just wanted another level of consensus and not going to get too far afield. So with that, if there's any questions, I would be willing to try to answer them for you.
Sensing your Representative Burkhart for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think this hurts the bill. It's just another level of review. And, excuse me, a number of these solid waste disposal districts, due to the amount of money involved and the future problems that they could bring, I think having another look at them is good. Thank you.
Anybody else for the first time? Second time? Question being called. All those in favor of third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 176 signify by saying aye. All those opposed? Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 176 has been adopted. Senate File 176, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Allemand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Clauston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haraldson? Harshman?
Excused.
Heiner? Henderson? Warnock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez-Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo. Walters. Ward. Washut. Western. Winter. Wiley. Yin. Zwanitzer Dan. Zwanitzer Dave. Speaker Summers.
Aye.
Harshman. Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 62 aye.
Senate File 76, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate File 176 has passed the House. The next bill for our consideration will be Senate File 24.
Senate File 24, sponsored by Judiciary. Financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, an act relating to banks, banking, and finance, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Representative Knapp, I believe there's an amendment.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I would move amendment number 1 to House Bill, or to Senate File 24, and ask for your favorable recommendation. The reason I brought this, you remember we were talking about, and this is a good bill, by the way, I really do like the bill. We were talking about an opt-in versus an opt-out type of proposal, and the more I got to thinking about it, I decided to look up that definition. Because this is a tool that was actually brought to us by the banks to say, help us to solve this issue that we see going on. So this amendment also was in consultation with the banks. So I went to the vulnerable adults definition, statute 3520-102, which helped me a lot because that is, to me, somewhat the opt-in piece. Because it says any person over 18 years of age or older who is unable to manage and take care of himself or his property without assistance as a result of advanced age or physical or mental disability. So in a way that narrows this down to a select group of vulnerable adults. And that to me is somewhat the opt-in. What this amendment does is I believe with any type of fraud, whether it's credit card fraud or this type of fraud, the key is an immediate response. And so that's why your bank will notify you by text or by phone call to say, did you make this charge? They want you to answer because it was an unusual deal, and then you just go on with life. I look at this the same way. What this amendment would do is it would allow the bank to notify the party of assistance prior to doing a report. Okay, so if there's a situation where an adult comes to a bank and something seems a little fishy, they can notify the trust. They can notify the guardian. They can notify the power of attorney, which is typically what happens anyway. And the good thing about this is it stops a lot of action before it needs to happen. Okay, so they can ask you, is this a legitimate charge? And you can say yes, no, or let's call the police, let's go ahead and fill out a report. I think it allows the bank to not be overwhelmed with reporting. I think it allows the Department of Health not to be overwhelmed with reporting, because I'm not sure how many employees are in the Department of Health under DFS to handle this. I've had one instance of calling in, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have used proper names, but I had one instance of calling in and they have an individual that works there. And as far as I know, they don't have a lot of staff to deal with this. So it doesn't overwhelm the department as well. And thirdly, it doesn't overwhelm law enforcement, because they do have to act on these. And if we had that one moment in time where we just knew in advance whether it was legitimate or not legitimate to move on with the report, I think that's important. So I'd ask for your favorable vote with the amendment.
Chairman Washut for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment has some merit, but there are some risks. And the risk, of course, is that that individual who gets contacted by the bank is actually a nefarious player in the scheme. And now you've alerted the criminal that folks are looking at their activities. And that may be detrimental long-term to the criminal investigation and so forth. But I think the important part of this bill is to prevent the fraud. And so this might be, if this allows the body to have some comfort in voting for this bill, it might be an acceptable risk. But I just want the body to understand that the person the bank is calling to say, hey, is this okay, might actually be the bad guy in the whole scheme of things.
Representative Craig for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I was going to say something along the lines of the good chairman. I mean, that's my concern as well. The way the bill is drafted right now without the amendment, the institution, the bank has to do a little bit of groundwork themselves before they notify anybody outside of the bank. They don't just call up the family member who quite likely could be the person causing the problem to begin with. And so that's my first concern. Although I appreciate the idea behind the amendment, and maybe if we had more time and it wasn't on third reading, we could actually get to the right language. And here's my bigger concern is taking out the word if and adding the word before, although it doesn't seem like a big deal, is a very big deal. Because now we're saying the only time you can actually notify a third party is before a report is submitted, not after, not during. And so that causes me a lot of concern, because the whole point of this is to allow for the investigation. If the investigation internally in the bank comes up with a belief that there is something nefarious going on, then you go ahead and you notify the department, and at the same time, you notify any third parties that might have the ability to help or know something about it. But you've already decided, hey, we're putting the hold on, we're submitting the report. And so nothing worse could happen to the vulnerable adult at that point. But adding the word before says, hey, the only time you can report out of the bank is before a report is submitted. And I guess that word actually causes me more problems than the rest of it, because now we're putting a timeline on when we can actually notify third parties. And I'm not sure that's what our banks would want. I think they want the freedom to be able to submit that anytime they need to after they've determined that something's going on. And so I guess that's my concern with the amendment. Not that it's not a good idea, and that it's not that we shouldn't be able to fix that maybe going forward on a future bill or piece of legislation.
Majority Whip, would you come up here for a second? Representative Oakley for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too am on and against, and appreciate any attempt and what this attempt was to try to make sure that there's communication with the family, but I just don't think this gets there. So I think, because what if you look at the bill, starting on page 4, like 4, 5, 6, is this section 702. That section 702 is sort of the meat of the bill of how this reporting is going to happen, which basically is somebody at the bank sees or suspects something. They notify this higher up qualified person in the bank. If that person suspects that actual exploitation is occurring, therefore a report is warranted, then it gives the creation of the report, and then they submit that report to DFS and possibly law enforcement. So that's what section 702 does, is creates this. Then over here in section 703, we have this ability created to notify a third party if warranted. And now what this does is start taking section 703 and writing before that report is submitted. So we're starting to confuse sections 702 and 703 in a way that just doesn't make any sense. So if you say before that report is submitted, then you're starting to confuse just what section 702 does. So I don't, and further, I don't think that there's anything. I mean, if we wanted to broaden when they can notify a third party, I guess I could look at that, but then it needs to be done just in section 703 not connecting that to the report. So that's my thought. I don't think this does what, necessarily what's intended, and it could mess with the process that we're trying to create. So I don't think this gets us where we want to. I would ask for a no vote on the amendment.
Representative Locke for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm on and for this amendment. This amendment actually gives us an opportunity to follow a procedure, a process that is a little bit more, in my opinion, makes a little bit more sense, where we actually do, all of these people, when you look at what the definition of a vulnerable adult, all of these people at some level have been identified, have been clearly defined as that. There has been someone designated as the appropriate person to take care of that person. This process, a bank obviously has to go through some logical assessment of what does this really look like? And in that logical assessment, as worded in this document, unless the institution suspects that specific third party, then the bank certainly should be notifying them before they start notifying the department. So in my opinion, on and for this amendment. I think it's very important that we put these kind of protections in place to make sure that this flows a little bit more gracefully and logically.
Representative Jennings for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I've had a lot of heartburn about this bill, and I've seen it die numerous times because I think it's a real issue that really needs to be dealt with. But when you begin monkeying with people's freedoms and what choices they've made down through their lives, and you're asking a bank to look into people's lives and decide whether they're vulnerable or whether they're not on this amendment, I'm on and for it. I've heard a number of people get up and say, well, this is risky. Well, welcome to life. You all got up this morning and life is risky. We're not going to solve every bit of this. This amendment gives a little bit of safeguard to freedom also. So on and in favor of the amendment.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Stith, maybe, for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that the amendment has the unintended consequence of tying the bank's hands. So the bank can notify a third party before they submit a report, but after they submit a report, they'll no longer be allowed to. So instead of promoting freedom, it actually ties businesses' hands and becomes more burdensome government regulation on banks. So on and against.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the bringer? Representative Craig Bohl for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I just want to reiterate that this is actually reducing the protection on the vulnerable adult. That's what the amendment does. It's allowing for disclosure before the bank has even decided whether or not they're going to submit the report to the department. And so it's reducing protection, not the other way around. And I think we just need to be clear that that's what the amendment does. On and against.
Representative Jennings for your second time.
I guess if we consider that we need to reduce people into making decisions on these people, and what about their freedoms? There are people, this will make mistakes, and we all know that there'll be mistakes made. It is not that we're trying to reduce the opportunity for the vulnerable adult. One, even in that terminology, we're asking somebody who's not necessarily have a full, clear view of who they are, who's vulnerable and who's not. And so this just gives a little bit of clarity for the freedom side of that, whether they're vulnerable or not.
Chairman Washut for your second time.
So let's talk about mistakes. If a mistake is made, the report goes to the department saying, hey, we think there's a problem here. We put a freeze on a transaction. What's the impact of that freeze? Well, for the most part, it's 5 days maximum. It'll be resolved sooner if possible. But it's a 5-day maximum freeze on a transaction. And that's the risk, right? That this person has the freedom today to make that transaction. But so too does the thief have the freedom to make that transaction today. And so what we're trying to build in is a little safeguard to allow the banks to put the brakes on for 5 days. And it will only be longer than 5 days if there are indications through the investigation that in fact we do have a nefarious thing going on. 5 days to keep people from losing their entire inheritance potentially, or their entire wealth, having their home sold by somebody from out from under them. These are the real life case examples that we heard about. So the worst that can happen is we slow this thing down for 5 days. Now, might there be some negative consequences, missed opportunities because sometimes the transaction is slowed down for 5 days? Yes. But these vulnerable adults need somebody. The reason they're classified as vulnerable adults is because they do need somebody else to assist in these endeavors. The banks have come to us saying, we are often the first responders. We are in the best position to say, hey, something looks out of sort here. This doesn't look like this person's normal spending pattern. This doesn't look like what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. Let's put the brakes on, take a look. 5 days.
Anybody else for their second time? Representative Knapp, bring us home.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And I'd just like to reiterate some points. I saw this as a vulnerable bill. I'd like all of us to support this, but I added some protections in place that helps the bill. We talked about this forcing banks. That's not the language we use in this amendment. The amendment says before a report is made, the bank may notify the third party. And going down in the bill on lines 5 through 7 on that same page 7, you'll see the statement, the bank notifies a third party unless the financial institution suspects the third party of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The safeguard is written into the bill. So we use language of before and may in conjunction with that safeguard. So that's favorable to the bill. The language that it replaced would have done the same thing, but it would have been at the time of the report. All we're saying is sometimes these things happen. Sometimes a transaction looks funny, but it's actually okay. No different than Life Alert notifies me in advance before they take my dad to the hospital to say, can you come check him out, see if things are okay, and then we'll go. So this alleviates a lot of things that could happen and could get set into place before it needs to. So on in favor of the amendment.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 24 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 24 has failed. Division being called. All those in favor of third reading amendment number 1, please rise. All those opposed, please rise. All right, thank you. Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 24 has failed, 28-32. The next amendment is third reading amendment number 2, Representative Locke. Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 2 for Senate File 24. And kind of a quick summary, one of the issues here that I saw in the bill, at least as I reviewed it, was the fact that it's not clearly identified or documented from the bank's perspective who's a vulnerable adult. Now, maybe those processes do exist in place, but I think in terms of this legislation, is all this amendment attempts to do is put in here that a vulnerable adult needs to be documented, and it would strike me that some robust documentation should be in there, who the vulnerable adult is and who the person who's responsible for that vulnerable adult. But in short, I just put in here, I believe this bill needs us to put the fact that the vulnerable adult needs to be documented, because we don't want the bank making a decision, we perceive this person as a vulnerable adult. We just don't want that type of confusion and that sort of thing happening from the bank's perspective. So that's where I'm at with this amendment. I would look for your favorable consideration for this amendment, and hopefully this helps the bill and makes it more palatable for folks. Thank you.
Chairman Zwanitzer, for your
Thank you.
first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a question. It sounds like you're asking the bank to profile their customers and divide them into who's a vulnerable adult and who's not. And I mean, maybe that's the point of the bill, but if they have to have some kind of registry list or some documentation in their system, I think that would upset me, hopefully in the future, if I'm ever, let's say I'm 80 and I don't think I'm vulnerable. Nobody wants to be considered or told they're a vulnerable adult. I can't imagine. So those are just my concerns, having some type of list of your customers. These are our vulnerable population and these are not. I just think if I'm a bank, I'm going to have real concerns having to make that judgment in some type of public registry list. I'm not sure how else they would do it.
Representative Yin, were you at the mic or not? Chairman Washut, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a question for the bringer. Who exactly prepares the documentation? What's it? I don't know about the process, and I'm afraid the amendment just has too many undefined aspects to it to be acceptable.
Representative Haroldson, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So honestly, on and against the amendment, and the reason being is we just heard it. We're profiling. This entire bill is profiling. I mean, if we're being 100% honest, we're saying you got to pick here. We're opening the door up for that. And so against the amendment, against the bill, you guys, do we want fraud? Absolutely not. But it's not a healthy place. So let's keep that in mind.
Representative Provenza, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess one of my concerns with this amendment is that you can potentially become a vulnerable adult fairly quickly. If someone has a stroke or other healthcare issues that could happen right now, then what do we do for folks that then are going to try to cash in on that, what they might consider an opportunity, if they haven't gone in and figured out that they're vulnerable at that point? So I don't know how you get in front of that when this can change so quickly. So no on the amendment.
Representative Yin, for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I guess the question for the bringer of the amendment is, what is the goal for keeping this list? Is it for the bank to continually review this list? Is it for the bank to give it to the government so the government can have a list of vulnerable adults? Is that a good idea? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out how this list is meant to be used if we're compiling a list of vulnerable adults. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Western, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, unless I'm reading it incorrectly, I'm worried it's a little unnecessary. I mean, if you kind of look at that Romanet D where it's requiring the banks to adopt these policies, probably pretty safe to assume that they're going to compile these lists no matter what, whether it's required by statute or not. I mean, I think if you're in a bank board meeting or an executive meeting, your leadership team, they're going to be asking, okay, well, we need to make sure that we're having documentation, because if we're going to put these people, give them this designation, we're going to need to have pretty good records to reflect on in case there's any, we ever come any undergo, or get subject to any sort of legal scrutiny or regulatory scrutiny. So that's kind of my thought, is that I'm pretty sure they're probably going to be doing this anyways, regardless of whether this amendment passes or not. And if I'm missing something, please do correct me.
Representative Oakley for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, on and against, and again, I appreciate trying to make the bill good, but this again, I think conflates and doesn't understand what we're trying to do here. So this allows banks to see something and then notify the people who would be in a position to take care of that. So it's not that we want banks doing medical diagnoses and getting into confidential records of like medical, some of these classifications to get to vulnerable adult is actually, like I say, a medical diagnosis or something. So it's not about getting banks to document vulnerable adults. It's to say they see something financial exploitation going on, create a report, pass it on to Adult Protection Services, who's in a position to investigate that and figure that out. So what this does is actually kind of keep everybody in their lane. We're allowing banks to point out that exploitation might be going on and then forwarding it on. We don't want the banks trying to figure out, and this is documenting when customers are vulnerable adults. And I mean, that's conflating kind of not at all what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep everybody in their lane so we can identify this and do the best by these people. But I don't think this gets there. So on and against.
Representative Knapp for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Good intentions, good intentions. I think it is dangerous to create legislation that basically you tie to one instance or two instances or three instances. We're talking about a very large segment of the population here, very large in Wyoming. And maybe 5 days is not inconvenient for a lot of you to have your account frozen, to wait for a report and possibly have it extended to 30 days. But to a lot of seniors who only have one checking account or one savings account, it is a big deal. So these things that we try to put in place with amendments is to be able to say, this is targeting a certain class of adult seniors or an adult with a mental disability. When you go into a bank to open up an account for a trust or with a person who is vulnerable, the bank automatically says, who is on this account? What can we do with this account? What are the limitations to the account? What gets flagged when we pull up the account for the person? This is not something that doesn't exist today. This is just an extra effort to say, this is the person we're concerned for. This is what we'd like to add to that account so that when you pull it up, you can identify them as a vulnerable adult. They don't wear stars on their heads. This is a large segment of the population we're talking about. So to have that little bit extra of identifying who it is we're looking out for is important. And then I do not believe we want to bypass the family. I don't believe we want to bypass the caretaker or bypass the power of attorney. Yes, in some instances, it may be a family member that's doing this, that is acting nefariously. But I'm concerned with the 80 to 90% of regular business, of an adult senior coming to do business that may be odd to somebody, buying some sheep that day, buying a truck that day, buying a boat that day, and choosing to do it cash. That's what I'm concerned about, is the unintended consequence of this legislation. So this extra piece with this amendment adds to the bank that ability to identify immediately whether that senior is a vulnerable person. Thank you.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Henderson for your first time.
Well, having worked in a bank for some years. Thank you,
Representative
Mr.
Henderson
Chairman.
through
Thank you,
me.
Mr. Chairman. Having worked in a bank for some years.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I said, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Start again. Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having worked in a bank for some years, I would just say that the banks are heavily regulated right now, and we are required to submit suspicious activity reports. And I give full credit and respect to those who are concerned about profiling. But we have a responsibility about private information too, to protect that. And I think this bill respects that. If you're the victim and this happens, then all the things we're talking about that we're concerned about will be in some ways become moot. Because I mean, if you unknowingly are victimized, well then it's too late. So I think the regulations that we have now are very solid. We have responsibility when you open the account to determine the identification is correct, determine who the beneficial owners are of the account, and the purposes. So it's pretty well covered. And so I think this is a good bill. I think the amendment is well-intentioned as far as the purpose, but in a sense, if you think about the private aspects of that, right? If you were the individual being on that list, would you have concerns about yourself being identified as perhaps an individual on a list like that? I think you would. And so I would avoid creating something that might eventually have an unintended consequence. No on the amendment, aye on the bill.
Representative Jennings for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'd urge all of you to go and look it up. There is a definition for vulnerable adult. It's already out there. We know what it is. Our department that takes care of that basically has a list and does those things already and works with and trying to protect those people. So who is a vulnerable adult? I would submit that every one of you in this room is. It's not necessarily that you're older or you lack mental capacity, although I've had that argued about me a time or two. It could be any circumstance that come along and bring you to that in your life. You'll all be vulnerable at some point. So without this amendment, think of what we're saying to the institution. I hear them say, oh, now wait a minute, the department would create a list. Well, the department already has a list. And the banking institutions already has a list for certain things that they're trying to protect us from. You can go to ask them for fraud protection, and which really is what this is. But if you don't put that out there, then every person that walks into that bank could be considered a vulnerable adult. They just haven't run into it yet. Maybe they haven't been completely adjudicated to that. But what about if circumstances change? Could you then be a vulnerable adult? Some tragedy comes along and befalls you. God forbid that should happen. And somebody goes on a drinking binge. Are they a vulnerable adult? And the bank looks at that. Now the bank has full access to profile that because that's what they're going to do. That is basically what we're saying in this bill. We're not saying, do you have to be 80? You have to have some kind of adjudication. Without some sort of parameter there, it is wide open. Every one of you will become a vulnerable adult. And so what we're doing is just saying, hey, let's narrow this down a little bit. We have a department that works with people that are already adjudicated that way or are already on that list. I'm not saying create a new list. I'm just saying put some parameters on it for the amendment.
Representative Craig for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So on and against the amendment, I don't understand how this amendment in practice will actually work. I mean, who puts together the list? How do you get on the list? Where do the names come from? And it really guts the purpose of the bill. The purpose of the bill is to let our banks make decisions on a case-by-case basis. If they see someone that they suspect is a vulnerable adult and that is being taken advantage of, they can react. By putting a list together, which I'm not back to that, I'm not sure how you get on the list. I mean, if it's maintained only by the department, then there's lots of people the department doesn't know about that would qualify as vulnerable adults. So does that mean your bank has to sit down with you every year and with your doctor and say, oh, yep, that person's going to qualify this year as a vulnerable adult? That's not what we're trying to get at here. But that's what the amendment does. And so I would say let's keep with the intent of the bill, give our banks a tool to help those who can't help themselves on and against the amendment.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the sponsor? Chairman Washit, for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, just a reminder that more than 30 states have very similar legislation on the books. None of those states are trying to repeal it because they've had terrible unintended consequences or because the banks have not done a good job with this provision. I appreciate that we all care about a couple of things. We care about our vulnerable adults and we care about our liberty. And this bill is asking us to make a balance point. I think it's also very important that we appreciate that what's being frozen here is a transaction, not an account. If grandma writes a $35 check at the grocery store and that appears completely normal, that still happens. It's that $15,000 withdrawal that catches everybody's red flag that causes the 5-day pause. So it's not like the vulnerable adult loses access to the account. It's just the individual suspicious transaction that might get flagged and interrupted again for a maximum of 5 days. As we balance the protection of our seniors and our vulnerable adults with individual liberty concerns, by reducing this bill from what it once was with 14 days down to 5 days, I think we've really come pretty close to finding that sweet spot for the proper balance between protection and liberty. No on the amendment, aye on the bill.
Representative Knapp, for your second time.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. You know, when we come up with bills and we try to add amendments to make bills better, to keep people's freedoms, this particular amendment has nothing to do with creating a list. All this amendment does is to say when your account gets pulled up, that there's a memo, there's a note, there's a flag, basically, to say something that's already been identified by statute as a vulnerable adult can be on your account. And that way, the bank can make a better determination of whether they need to report this. There's nothing extra added. You can add this to your account at any time. When a person becomes a vulnerable adult, you can go into your bank and say, hey, this has happened. We want you to know we now take care of their account as a trust, as a power of attorney, so that it adds that one extra layer of protection for this person. That's what this is about. So to add this amendment doesn't require anything extra. And I guarantee the banks do this every day by adding something to your account that says, hey, this is special because there's another person involved, there's another layer of protection. It happens now. On in favor of the amendment, opposed to.
Anybody else for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Locke, bring us home.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's kind of interesting that we, we push back for having documentation, just having some documentation. And it's interesting also that we push back that we don't know how this is going to work. Well, banks have procedures and put procedures in place all of the time to make sure certain things are appropriately documented. They do this type of documentation, and that's what this amendment's attempting to do, is put something in here that says, for these cases, as very elegantly spoken by the previous speaker, coming up with an approach and a process and a procedure that makes sense where for these cases, when a person is identified and defined as a vulnerable adult, clearly defined in our statutes, by the way, have a procedure in place to make sure that account gets flagged. That's what this is attempting to do, to make sure that it's easy to identify these people. Because it's sort of interesting, I find it interesting that we're more comfortable with the bank making that judgment on the fly, right? And if we talk about profiling, this whole bill is profiling, and that was spoken before as well. This entire bill is profiling. And oh, by the way, we're giving a bank teller the opportunity to profile in the absence of any documentation or any flag or anything like that. They're going to make that call. I always joke with my wife when I go out to breakfast. Sometimes I really like my trashy clothes. And I joke and I say, all the restaurants think you're taking some guy off the street in for breakfast, and I think you're a saint, right? Imagine if I follow my wife into the bank dressed like that. Now my wife is the vulnerable adult because there's this guy over here saying, geez, I want you to take out $5,000. Scary, right? I'm just saying, let's put some sideboards on this. Let's put some documentation on this that makes sense. And this, in the absence of something that documents a flag that comes up on account that says this is a vulnerable adult, we're going to let a 22-year-old teller call the ball on that. That I don't believe that's what we really want to do. And I do know that there will be unintended consequences associated with that. Thank you. On and for the amendment. Thank you for your consideration.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 24 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 24 has failed. Senate File 24 having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Allemand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Clauston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Harrelson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Hornock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez-Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washit? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Zwanitzer Dan? Zwanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers? Are there any changes? Davis? Any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 36 aye, 25 no, 1 excused.
Senate File 24, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate File 24 has passed the House. Representative Smith, do you have a privilege?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Privilege.
Please.
All righty. So the Lingo Fort Laramie Student Council, if you guys will stand, they are here from my district. They are accompanied by their advisor, Aaron Estes. Their president is Gage Gibson, Vice President Loudon Bremer, Secretary Natalie Speckner. The students have shifted their school culture through their leadership, hard work, commitment to make it a positive place to learn. They have done a lot of projects like helping eliminate student lunch debt, and they are here learning how to be active in their local government. Please join me by welcoming the Lingo Fort Laramie High School Student Council.
Student council, well, welcome to the House. And I started in a student council too, so think about that as you go through your careers. Representative Stiff, privilege,
Mr. Speaker, privilege of the floor.
please.
In the North Gallery, I have my Valentine, my life partner, and the best person I've ever known, Lisa Ryberg.
Welcome to the House. Was there any other privileges? Did I see? Somebody came up to me. Did you have one? Oh yeah, Representative Yin, privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So lunch today is in the Capitol Extension provided by the Equality State Policy Network, Policy Center, and they're a group that promotes transparency in government. So please join them.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader. I think we're done.
Having been promised multiple times the bill's only going to take 2 minutes, I resolve the House go into recess and get back at 2 o'clock.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. We stand in recess until 2 p.m.